Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests of all gender, welcome back to my channel and welcome to Terrible Books for Terrible Times. Now, all of these books are also classics. So, one could wonder, why is it that when I was in a bad place and I wanted to read books involving bad characters, I went for these? Who's to say? Some I've read before, some I haven't, some I have read before, but it was like 10 years ago, so I have really nothing to compare it to. And welcome to a wrap up. First, we have Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I must say, I never know what type of covers I'm going to get when I buy books secondhand, and I absolutely love this one. It does something for me, as well as this smaller image on the back. I absolutely love it. I'm pretty sure you all know these stories, so I'm not going to bore you with summaries, but in terms of who my least favorite characters are in this book, I'm going to say everyone except the children who are too young to know better. Now, you may say, hello, they're children. Their ages are from like 6 to maybe 12 or 13. They've crash landed on an island during the evacuation of a major war. They're just trying to survive. Of course, they're going to make mistakes. Yes, of course, they're going to make mistakes, but also there are multiple murders in this book, and these murders are all ridiculous. If it was something like two boys are fighting over, the last coconut on the island, if two boys are having an argument over, the last piece of hog meat or a pool of fresh water, somehow I could understand that, a battle for resources. However, all of the chaos and violence, and as I said, child murder committed by other children that happens in this book is over the most ridiculous things. It is a complete degradation of all the customs and politeness and manners and societal standards that they once had when they were, in an environment with adults, and a full breakdown into the most base, awful instincts of mankind. And yes, I get that is basically the plot of the book. Yes, I understand that you're seeing these boys who are, good, classic, clean English chaps in an environment in which they act like monsters. And what does it mean for children in general, but also just people to devolve to such places, to such standards when they're not helmed in by the rigid guidelines of society? It's a short book, but it'll get your heart racing. And the only critique of it I actually have is, while I understand that some of the intense description of the island itself is really relevant in terms of plotting the geography so you know where each character is, and in terms of the metaphorical nature of the creepers in the jungle and the way the ocean dragged things off the beach, I get that. But there were days where I was reading this book and I'm like, I just gotta get through 3 more pages, the way the sunlight sparkled on the sea, and then I can get back to these ridiculous characters. So The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Next, we have another short one, another classic, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. In this book, you have Guy Montag, a fireman who is responsible for destroying books with fire and destroying houses in which they're found, as opposed to setting them out. This is set in a dystopian world in which people go through their lives numb. They go through their lives completely desensitizing themselves to violence and to media. They are very separate from each other intellectually, separate emotionally, and you have this character, Guy, who goes upon this psychological, mental, and emotional awakening. He's put in a really dangerous position when he starts to ask questions he's not supposed to ask, when he starts to try to read, which is illegal. And my least favorite character in this is Mildred Montag, which would be strange to some who have read this book. Mildred is Guy's wife. Now, there are other people in this book who do objectively worse things. We have teenagers trying to murder people, run them over with their cars. We have firemen who are burning people alive. You have firemen who are programming a horrifying, lethal mechanical hound out to murder people, including innocent people. But Mildred Montag grinds my gears like nobody else because she is the pinnacle of indoctrination. She is so deep into this belief that there is of nothing of value in the world, in books and literature and art. There's no value whatsoever in having real conversations with other people that are about things other than gossip or what's on the TV. She is so numb that she tries to commit suicide, is saved by her husband, Guy, and the next morning won't even admit that that's what she did. And I understand that there are definitely nuances here when it comes to mental illness. I understand her purpose in the story as a character, but for some reason, I have more empathy for the characters who know exactly what they're doing. I am going to kill this person and destroy these books to maintain the status quo. I have more respect for that objectively evil person than I do for someone like Mildred, who allows herself to be swept along in the the current. So Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Next, we have 1984 by George Orwell. This is an interesting one because in this book, I would say I cannot think of a specific character who I hold like intense malice toward. I'm kind of invested in everyone, even the so-called villains of this story. But in this book, this story that unfortunately gets referenced a lot in American politics, probably not for the best. So this book is set in a world in which propaganda, doublethink, newspeak, all of these words are very, very common in society. It is very rigid and controlled. People who are members of the party are under strict surveillance all the time, and they are constantly trying to make sure people think the right thing, say the right thing, do the right thing. Anyone who even has like the slightest hint, the slightest inkling of stepping out of line, of questioning the blatant propaganda and blatant lies that are blasted through the radio and the TV, any of that is immediately taken to the Ministry of Love, which is where torture and punishment happens. It's a world in which war is peace and freedom is slavery, and everything is taught to you in the opposite as a form of control. 1984, I think, is a fantastic novel. I haven't read anything else by George Orwell, not even Animal Farm, so I can't really compare it to his other works, but one of the reasons this book punches me in the gut is because it feels realistic. I know that that's something that is often said of dystopian novels that stand the test of time, but the entire last portion of this novel, spoiler alert, involves characters being broken down and built back up to the point where they genuinely deeply believe the lies that the society is telling. There are so many people, whether they're aware of it or not, that you meet in this text that are eliminated, that are disappeared because they know too much, because they're too smart. In some cases, they're so dumb they can't even understand what it is they need to do to like push these lies effectively. And there's something so sinister and horrifying of the ways in which physical torture and psychological torture and constant questioning and different sorts of punishments and praise can genuinely change the way a person's mind thinks, to the point that they believe the lie. They believe what's impossible. Something that's often repeated in this book is, how do you make someone believe that 2 + 2 = 5? And that's what's so terrifying to me about it. So this one, it's really more about the system that I'm like, yes, this world is terrible, I want to read about it, as opposed to an individual person. I'm sure that there are people who read this immediately after certain political elections in recent years and like could not handle it, but no matter when you read it, if you read it, even if you don't like his writing style, similarly to Lord of the Flies and Fahrenheit 451, this is one of those texts that once you've read it, you see how many other films and TV shows and books and YouTube videos it has inspired. It really is a staple in the dystopian genre. Next, we have a book that is not a classic in the way the other ones are, but I did read it in school, in high school, and it's Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Now, something that I think is important to note for all of the books I've mentioned so far is they were all written decades ago, and this one as well. And I say that not to excuse anything you may be potentially uncomfortable reading, but specifically for this book, which focuses on a man who has a mental disability, who volunteers, although there are questions on how can he really consent to such a thing when he doesn't really understand it, but volunteers for this rare, dangerous procedure to increase his intelligence. And I don't really consider this to be a spoiler because it happens in the first 2 chapters, but it works. And as his intelligence increases, he starts experiencing and understanding life completely differently. His relationships, going back in his memories to understand and forgive, but also, just let himself be consumed with rage at the understanding of what his family did to him, how they treated him, the different ways they try to push him to be different, or the ways that their complacency may have hurt him. His emotional life is trying to catch up at the same pace of his intellectual life. And throughout all of this, he's being treated like a science experiment. He's being treated like Algernon, which is the name of a mouse who also underwent this experiment. And I don't want to reveal the ending of whether the experiment works fully, whether there are side effects, how the story ends, but it's a heartbreaking story to me because it asks a lot of the questions around what does it mean to live a life well lived, and how do we treat human beings that other people view as inferior. And in the book, they say he starts out with an IQ of about 67 or 68. The reason I mentioned when it was written is because a lot of the medical terminology they use for Charlie and people like him is no longer appropriate. For example, they use the R word, which is now considered to be a slur, but at the time that was just his designation designation. It's like, oh, anybody with an IQ below this is, this word. And so that was a little jarring to read when I was revisiting this book. But I think one of the reasons it stuck with me is because Charlie says something at one point in the book that basically amounts to questioning, is his life actually better now that he is more intelligent? And to be clear, Charlie was a type of person who, he could live independently. He had a job doing simple manual labor. Like, he wasn't someone that needed a ton of care in order to, get dressed and, go sit with friends in the park, look at comic books, go to work, or go to class, those kinds of things. But I think that he hit on a really interesting point about, was I or was I not happier before I had this procedure and I knew all the things that I know now? At the same time, having this procedure has allowed me to do things and learn things I never would have experienced. And it's hard to say that I would want to go back to how I was before, but how do we define happiness and how do we define a life worth living? And especially around modern conversations with people deciding if they want to continue a pregnancy based on the likelihood if the fetus has Down syndrome. This was another one of those books where I was like, there's no individual character that I hate. It's more of like, I hate this situation. Like, I hate that Charlie is put into a world in which he is not set up to succeed. And I take that back. If there's one character I really hate, it's his mom, because she is abusive as hell and she leaves him with trauma that affects him long into his adulthood, even when he isn't intelligent enough, as in he has a high Q high enough to understand where she was coming from and why she reacted the way she did and how even her best intentions tried to hurt him. So quite a sad book. However, I think it gives a lot to think about, and so that's why I would recommend it, and that is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Next, we have another controversial book, and that is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. It is important to note that this version of A Clockwork Orange is the way it was originally published in the UK. There's a foreword in this book in which it says that the UK had the complete manuscript by Anthony Burgess, and the US was the only version that did not have the final chapter. So depending on if you've read this book or not, you may not know whether Alex, the main character, the main vandal, hoodlum, ever becomes reformed. And I don't want to spoil it if you have not, depending on the version that you've read, but I will say that I read this book knowing that there was going to be an extra chapter that I wasn't familiar with. I read up to that point, kind of took a pause, and then read the next chapter. And what was interesting to me is that Mr. Burgess in the foreword says that, authors are not the best judge of their own work. So although his original vision for the work was to have this final chapter, if you're someone who thinks it's better without it, then so be it. And frankly, I'm someone who thinks that it's better without it. I understand his argument that to have a character who undergoes no character progression whatsoever, who is the same at the very end as they are at the very beginning, doesn't feel like a real person. But at the same time, when I look at A Clockwork Orange, I don't look at it as a story in which I'm expecting necessarily a character arc or even the slightest bit of redemption. The last line of this book, if you take away that final chapter, is a line along something like, and I was cured, all right, or I was cured, something with double meaning, with layers of irony, with definitely I hear at the level of sarcasm. And I loved that. I don't love the character Alex or any of the horrifying things he does. Of all the books on this list, like, this is probably the one that has the most trigger warning. So please keep that in mind before you read it or if you read it. But what I enjoyed about the story is the idea that, can morality be scientifically changed? Is it moral to fundamentally mess with someone's character or nature, even if you're changing it for the better? What does it mean to have a society in which you have people who are used to using violence as a form of entertainment, in which they are recruited into law enforcement metaphors and then use techniques of fear in order to control people who are simply just trying to make the world a better place? Like, there is so much in this book that fascinates me, despite the horrors that Alex and his brood commit. But those horrors themselves also do make it challenging to read, because I don't enjoy reading about abuse and assault and things of that nature. Oddly enough, though, and this might be controversial, even though Alex is probably objectively the worst character in this book, the group of people I had the most ire for were some of the political activists, simply because, similarly with some other characters in other books I mentioned, they were not the type of people to say, I have a goal, and so I am going to threaten the lives and the livelihood and cause pain and suffering to other people in order to achieve that goal. They're the type of people to always see themselves taking the high road, to always see everything they do as morally just. For some reason, I seem to have more understanding for a fictional character that says, I enjoy the thrill I get from killing, so I'm going to kill that person, as opposed to the character that says, well, I don't really have any strong feelings about killing another person, but I do think that for this specific goal, killing somebody would be the right thing to do. So I'm not really a murderer. I'm just someone who's like really convicted or has really convicted beliefs and like goes after them. That may make zero sense if you have never read this book, but there are certain moments in here I don't want to talk about explicitly because I do think that would spoil some of the surprise about the true nature of certain people in this story. So Clockwork Orange, probably of all these books, is the quintessential terrible book for a terrible time. This is the equivalent of feeling, existential dread and overwhelming hopelessness and anger about the world, and then making it worse by reading about a book that basically talks about the same thing. It's the equivalent of, being sad over a breakup and then listening to sad breakup songs to perpetuate the cycle. But that's how I like to spend my time. Next, we have Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, the semi-autobiographical story of a young woman who spends a summer in New York City at a fashion internship, heads back home after the summer, and is really just struggling with her mental health. She's in and out of a psychiatric ward. She has various key experiences in her young life, such as her first apprenticeship, losing her virginity, finding out that the man that she thought she wanted to marry isn't the man that she thought at all. And throughout all of it, Sylvia Plath, to me, writes like someone who would be alive right now. Again, this is another book that was written several decades ago, and it's so strange and like genuinely shocking to me to have read this book at the time that I did and have pages, chapters where I felt like I was hearing a young woman in 2021 speak about her body and her mother and her mental health and her desire to find something that wants to keep her afloat. But then at the same time, I'll get to one page and I'm like, a negress? Oh, right. Like there's various moments where Sylvia Plath uses racial slurs or, prejudicial language or just, says things that remind me that this was written several decades ago. And that always pulls me out of it. 'Cause I'm like, what was the purpose of using this East Asian slur? Oh, right. That in this time period, this character just like, yeah, that's what that person is. And it's those moments that I'm like, oh, right, this book was written decades ago. And again, I'm not saying that just because something is written decades ago, it makes it excusable. I'm saying something that I think is so strange, but also powerful about Sylvia Plath's voice is that if you took those moments out, I promise you, you would think this was written in 2021 with the clarity in which she speaks and the way that nowadays we try to be more open about mental health, but at the same time are least publicly not comfortable discussing the messiest, stickiest, most problematic parts of it. I did read this book at the wrong time, as in it was more triggering than I expected it to be considering my own mental health. But at the same time, that quote from the end of this, like the main character who's based off Sylvia is sitting at a funeral of someone who committed suicide and hears the old brag of her heart, I am, I am, I am. And you can tell that Sylvia Plath, even if you knew nothing about her, was also a poet, known primarily for her poetry based off like moments of poetry like that in this book. Gosh, I adore this book. I hate that reading it means I know I have to slog through at least like 5 or 6 instances of, racial caricature or racial comments. But for me, you do you. BookTube, in my opinion, has very inconsistent opinions about problematic authors. If you want to read it, just be warned about that. For me personally, the 5 or 6 times that it happens does not take away from how powerful I think this book is. And especially given the context of Sylvia Plath, unfortunately, taking her life not long after this was written, I think it also lends to a certain amount of poignancy. I do not believe that you need to experience something firsthand in order to write about it truthfully firsthand, but you can tell that Plath knows what it is to be. You can tell Plath knows what it is to experience the darkness of certain moments, and she writes about it in a way that I wish I could write about it and articulate it. So despite its flaws, I absolutely adore this book, and I probably always will. And finally, we have the thickest boy of the bunch, and that is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. This took me a minute, and this version has a quote from Harper Lee on the front that I want to read because it helped me get through it. Catch-22 is the only war novel I've ever read that makes any sense. This book is frustrating and chaotic and absurd and has a meandering cyclical timeline in which very few sections happen in chronological order. It is a book that I'm sure would make a ton more sense upon second reading, knowing where it all connects. It is a book that I understand why it's so unique. I understand why it's so popular, but at the same time, this was the closest I have ever gotten to busting a blood vessel while trying to read. There were so many characters in this book that I wanted to take out back and shoot. And the most frustrating one was Arfie. Now, this is a large cast, and this is a large cast because this is a war novel, and all of these characters are deployed. These are soldiers and lieutenants and doctors and mess hall captains, bombardiers and navigators. They are fighting, they are planning, they are on leave in cities and getting drunk and finding prostitutes to sleep with. They are trying to stay alive. They are dying for stupid reasons. They are fighting for stupid reasons. And the reason I love that quote from Harper Lee at the front, it's the only war novel that makes sense, is because this book doesn't make sense and therefore makes such a statement about war. Now, this book was written and published around the time of the Vietnam War. And I think that's relevant because in American history, the Vietnam War, as far as I understand, it was one of those periods in which it was like, what the hell are we fighting for? What are we doing over there? Like, this was not no great war atmosphere in which it was an American duty to go there and punch old Adolf Hitler in the jaw, and everyone's gathering around and buying their war bonds, and ladies are darning their stockings as opposing to buying new ones because we need that nylon for the boys. It was not that kind of environment, and I feel like you can really tell the context in which the book was written by knowing a little bit about the Vietnam War history. I will say though that in terms of the structure and the chaos and the amount of characters, this is the only book I have ever read in which I would finish a chapter and then go to Spark Notes and read the summary of the chapter. That is how, there is a lot going on. And for some people, that is going to make this impossible to get through. And I respect you for it. I wanted to finish it. I'm glad I finished it because, again, it's one of those books that once you get to the end, it makes everything that happened before then make so much sense. And because it is absurdist, it is one of those books that actually did make me laugh out loud because I was like, Lord, what is happening? The prostitutes, the tomatoes, the doctor's dead, but he's not dead. I'm just like, it's chaos. And always Arfie, who is, again, my least favorite character. Every time he was on the page, I wanted to just rip it in half like a strong man ripping apart a phone book at a county fair. I've never read anything else by Joseph Heller, so I really don't know if this is how he writes or if this was a very specific intentional choice to reflect the hypocrisy and the chaos and the deep conflicting emotions of being a soldier at war, since Joseph Heller was a veteran. But I do see why so many people read it. I do see why it's required in a lot of schools, even though I didn't read it in school. This is one of those books that I'm like, did I like this? I don't think I did. And I cannot imagine when I'm going to want to pick this up again, but I am damn sure not going to unhaul it because at one point in my life, I know I will reread it. And on that second read, I know for a fact I will get so much more out of it. And there are various scenes, various moments, various conversations that even now, about a month or so after reading this book, still pop in my head and still give me something to chew on and to dissect and deconstruct. And I do think that is a sign of a good book, even if I cannot definitively say that this is a good book, in my opinion, or if I would recommend it. But it definitely involved a lot of terrible things and terrible people, which was scratching that itch for me during my terrible time. So that was the last book that I read while I was suffering in a psychological pit of despair. But all that being said, these were my list of books, terrible books for terrible times. I don't know when I'll see you with the next wrap up, but it definitely will not be stories like these. Have a good one.